The sun hung over Blackwater Falls like a hammer poised to strike, and beneath it, the stockyard baked in a heat so fierce it seemed to warp the air itself. Dust rose in lazy spirals from the trampled earth, each gust of wind carrying the mingled stench of manure, unwashed bodies, and something darker. The sour tang of fear that clung to the line of prisoners standing on the rough plank stage. The wood was old and splintered gray with age and stained with God knew what. Flies circled lazily, drawn by the sweat and desperation. Mabel Carter stood in that line with iron shackles biting into her wrists, the metal hot enough to burn. She kept her back straight because her mother had taught her that much. No matter what they take from you, they cannot take your spine unless you give it to them. But inside, beneath the facade of dignity, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had been standing in the sun for over an hour, and thirst had turned her mouth to cotton. The brown dress she wore, once her Sunday best, now hung loose on her frame, the fabric coarse and sticky with sweat. She fixed her eyes on the hills beyond the corral fence, those distant ridges of stone and scrub that looked like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. If she stared hard enough, she could almost imagine herself there instead of here. Almost forget the voices of the men who pressed close to the stage, their eyes crawling over her like insects. The auctioneer was a wiry man, with a voice like a rusty gate hinge, high-pitched and grating. He stood beside the sheriff, a thick-necked brute whose star-shaped badge sat crooked on a vest that had not been washed in weeks. The sheriff read names from a ledger, his voice flat and bored, as if he were reciting a grocery list instead of selling human lives. "Next item," the auctioneer called, and Mabel felt a rough hand on her shoulders shoving her forward. She stumbled, but caught herself lifting her chin. Mabel Carter, age 24, 3 years hard labor for unpaid passage and debts owed to the Silver Spur Company. Starting bid $1. $1. That was what her life was worth in this place. The crowd pressed closer. She could smell the whiskey on their breath, see the yellowed teeth and the way their eyes narrowed, calculating. A rancher with forearms like fence posts reached up and squeezed her upper arm, testing the muscle as if she were a mule. She flinched, but did not pull away. To resist was to invite violence, and she had learned that lesson the hard way during the 3 days she had spent in the town jail, where the deputy had made it clear that a black woman with no money and no friends had no rights at all. $2, someone shouted from the back. $3, called another voice, accompanied by laughter. At the far rail, almost hidden in the shadow cast by the water tower, a man watched in silence. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a beaded buckskin shirt that caught the light in small flashes of blue and white. 2 eagle feathers were bound into his long black braids, and his face, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark eyes that seemed to see everything was still as carved stone. His name was Honiahaka, though the white men in town called him Hawk, because they could not be bothered to learn his proper name. He had come to Blackwater Falls to negotiate, not to interfere. His people, the Lakota, who lived along the shrunken banks of the Blackwater River, were dying slowly from thirst, their crops withering their children, carrying empty buckets back and forth as if repetition alone could conjure water. The dam that Montgomery Steele had built 5 years ago was choking the river, and Montgomery's men collected tolls from anyone who wanted to drink. Honiahaka had come to speak with the Baron, to appeal to whatever shred of humanity might exist beneath the layers of greed. But Montgomery had not deigned to see him. And so Honiahaka had spent 2 days in this town, watching and waiting and learning just how deep the rot went. Now he watched as a drunk miner with a scraggly beard stumbled forward, his hand raised. $4, the miner shouted, and I'll work her day and night every cent's worth. The crowd laughed a sound like breaking glass. Mabel closed her eyes for a moment, trying to pull herself inward away from the voices and the heat and the hands. She thought of her mother, who had been born a slave and had lived to see freedom, who had taught Mabel to read by candlelight in a shack with dirt floors. She thought of the letters from Elias, her late husband letters, that had been full of promises about land and opportunity and a new life. She thought of the mine collapse that had taken him 2 months after she arrived, and the debts that had appeared afterward like ghosts, debts for passage, for lodging, for fees she had never heard of. And then the arrest, the chains, and now this standing on a stage while men bid on her labor as if she were livestock. The auctioneer raised his gavel. $4 going once. She walks with me. The voice cut through the noise like a blade, low and accented, but perfectly clear. The crowd fell silent, heads turning. Honyahaka stepped forward, his hand resting on the carved handle of a hunting knife at his belt. The other extended with $5 silver balanced on his palm. The coins caught the sunlight gleaming. For a moment, no one moved. The air seemed to tighten, as if the whole town had drawn a breath and forgotten to let it out. Then hands flew to gun belts, hammers clicking back on revolvers. The sheriff took a step forward, his face flushing red. "Now, hold on," he began. But the auctioneer, who had spent enough years in this business to know when to take money and when to ask questions, snatched the coins from Honyahaka's hand. $5, he announced, his voice cracking slightly. "Sold to the gentleman in the buckskin." The sheriff opened his mouth to object, then closed it again. $5 was $5, and Montgomery Steele was not here to countermand the sale. Besides, the Lakota warrior looked like the kind of man who would not back down, and a brawl in the stockyard would cost more than it was worth. The sheriff spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and turned away, muttering. Honyahaka stepped onto the stage and signed the contract with an X, the pen awkward in his calloused hand. Technically, he was now Mabel's employer for 3 years, the holder of her labor debt. As they left the platform together, the crowd parted reluctantly, and someone spat in their path. A boy with a slingshot sent a rotten apple flying. It splattered against Honyahaka's shoulder, and the mob laughed. Mabel flinched, her body tensing for a blow, but Honyahaka simply placed himself between her and the worst of the jeers. His broad back a wall between her and the hatred. He did not speak, did not hurry, just walked with the same unhurried dignity that he had carried into the stockyard, as if the insults and the violence were beneath his notice. They walked through the street in silence, Mabel still shackled, until they reached a narrow alley beside a livery stable. Only then did Honyahaka stop and look down at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "You wasted your money, mister." Mabel said, her voice hoarse from thirst and the effort of holding back tears. Her accent carried the soft vowels of the South, the rhythm of cotton fields and Sunday hymns. "They'll just take me back soon as they feel like it. That's how it works here." Honyahaka studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "I paid to show them something," he said quietly. "Their coins can cut chains too, if they choose." She did not understand what he meant, but there was something in his voice, a kind of quiet conviction, that made her want to believe him. Honyahaka's mission in Blackwater Falls was not mercy, though mercy played a part. He had come on behalf of his people, the Lakota bands, who had been pushed onto marginal land along the riverland that the white government had promised them in treaties that were worth less than the paper they were written on. For a time, the river had been enough. The Blackwater flowed strong and clear, and the Lakota had planted gardens, raised children, and tried to live as they always had. Then Montgomery Steele had arrived. Montgomery was a man who understood that, in the West, power flowed from 2 sources, water and violence. He had built his dam 5 years ago with timber hauled from the mountains and labor bought cheap or stolen outright. The dam turned the river into a trickle downstream, and Montgomery charged tolls for every drop. Farmers paid. Ranchers paid. The Lakota who had no money watched their crops wither and their children grow hollow-eyed with hunger. Honeyahaka had come to negotiate, to plead if necessary, to offer labor or trade in exchange for water. But Montgomery Steele did not negotiate with Indians, and his foreman had told Honeyahaka to leave town before he ended up in chains himself. So Honeyahaka had waited and watched and learned. He learned that Montgomery owned not just the dam, but the silver mine in the hills and the largest ranch in the territory and half the businesses in town. He learned that the sheriff was on Montgomery's payroll, as was the judge, and that anyone who opposed the Baron tended to disappear or meet with unfortunate accidents. He learned about the labor contracts, the forged debts, the mail-order brides who arrived in Blackwater Falls only to find themselves trapped in a kind of slavery that had no name but was no less real for that. And he learned that the rot in this town went deeper than one man, deeper than greed. It was a rot born of a system that allowed men like Montgomery to own rivers and lives, to write laws that served only themselves, to build empires on the backs of the desperate and the dispossessed. When Honeyahaka had seen Mabel on that stage, he had recognized something in her eyes, a kind of defiant sorrow that he knew well. It was the look of someone who had been broken, but refused to shatter. He had not planned to buy her contract. He had not planned to do anything but watch and wait. But the drunk miner's words had lit a fire in his chest, and before he could think better of it, he had pushed through the crowd and put down his last $5. Now he led her through the town to the office of Dr. Franklin Hayes, a gray-haired physician who worked out of a cramped room above a dry goods store. Franklin was one of the few men in Blackwater Falls who had spoken to Honeyahaka with something approaching respect, and Honeyahaka trusted him as much as he trusted any white man, which was to say not much, but enough. Franklin looked up from the gash he was stitching on the forehead of a Lakota boy, his expression weary. "You bought her," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "For 3 years," Honeyahaka replied. "Can you remove the chains?" Franklin set down his needle and wiped his hands on a rag. "I can. Whether they'll stay off is another question." He looked at Mabel. "You all right, miss?" "I've been worse," Mabel said, though her voice shook slightly. "Least I ain't dead yet." Franklin smiled a small, sad smile. "That's the spirit." He gestured to a chair. "Sit. I'll get the blacksmith." While Franklin was gone, Honeyahaka and Mabel sat in silence. The boy with the stitched forehead stared at Mabel with wide eyes and then said something in Lakota. Honeyahaka replied gently, and the boy nodded and looked away. "What did he say?" Mabel asked. "He asked if you were my woman," Honeyahaka said. "I told him no. I told him you were free and I was only holding the paper until you could walk away." Mabel looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the tiredness in his eyes, the lines around his mouth that spoke of hard winters and harder choices. She saw the scars on his hands, the calluses that came from work and weapons. And she saw something else, something she had not expected: kindness. "Why did you do it?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me. You got your own troubles, I can see that plain as day. So why spend your last money on a stranger?" Honeyahaka was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "My grandmother used to tell a story. She said that the world is a river and we are all stones in it. Some stones are large, some small. But the river shapes us all and we shape the river. When I saw you on that stage, I thought, if I do nothing, the river flows one way. If I do something, maybe it flows another." He looked at her. "I do not know if I did the right thing. But I could not do nothing." Mabel felt something crack open inside her, something she had kept locked tight since Elias died. It was not hope. Hope was too fragile a thing for a place like this. But it was something close. A possibility. Franklin returned with the blacksmith, a burly man with soot-streaked hands, who grumbled as he worked the lockpicks. When the shackles finally fell away, Mabel rubbed her raw wrists and felt the blood flow back into her hands. The relief was so intense, it almost hurt. "Thank you," she whispered. Franklin nodded. "Don't thank me yet. Montgomery Steele paid for your passage, or so the paperwork says. That makes you his property in the eyes of the law, contract or no contract. If he decides he wants you back, he'll send men. And they won't be gentle." "Then what do I do?" Mabel asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "You run," Franklin said bluntly, "or you fight. There's no third option in this town." Hanyahaka took Mabel to Widow Smith's boarding house, a narrow 2-story building, with peeling paint and a sagging porch that groaned under their weight. Widow Smith was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked Mabel up and down, then looked at Hanyahaka, and her mouth tightened. "I don't usually take coloreds," she said, "or Indians." "You will take her," Hanyahaka said. And there was something in his voice, not a threat exactly, but a certainty that made the widow hesitate. "How much?" she asked finally. Hanyahaka counted out the last of his coins and placed them on her desk. 3 nights, a room with a lock, and you say nothing to anyone." Widow Smith scooped up the money and pointed to the stairs. "Top floor end of the hall. Keep to yourself and we'll have no trouble." The room was small and spare, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a window that looked out over the alley. But it had a door with a lock, and to Mabel, who had spent the last 3 days in a jail cell with 5 other women, it felt like a palace. Hanyahaka set her small bundle of belongings on the chair clothes that the jail matron had returned to her, along with a few personal items. "Tomorrow you decide," he said, standing in the doorway. "I can send you east on the stage with what little I have left, or you ride north with me to my people's camp. But the choice is yours. I do not own you, Mabel Carter. No one owns you." He closed the door gently, and Mabel listened to his footsteps recede down the hall. She sat on the bed, her legs trembling from exhaustion and relief and fear all mixed together. For a long time, she just sat there, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open, half expecting men to come and drag her back to the stockyard. But no one came. Eventually, she rose and wedged the chair under the doorknob, and then lay down on the bed, fully clothed. Sleep did not come easily. Her mind churned with memories and questions. She thought about Elias, about the letters he had sent her back in Tennessee, letters full of promises. "Come west, Mabel. There's land here, opportunity. We can build something together." She had believed him. She had spent every cent she had saved on the wagon train, endured 2 months of dust and heat, and the leering eyes of men who thought a black woman traveling alone was fair game. And when she had finally arrived in Blackwater Falls, Elias had been there, waiting, all smiles and charm, and they had married in a little church that smelled of wood smoke and old hymnals. For 2 months they had lived in a company house near the silver mine. Elias worked underground, and Mabel took in washing and mending to earn a few extra dollars. It had not been the life he had promised, but it had been a life. Then came the collapse. A tunnel deep in the mine had given way, burying a dozen men under tons of rock. Elias had been one of them. They had brought his body out 3 days later, and Mabel had buried him in a plot on the edge of town, where the graves were marked with wooden crosses that would rot away in a season or 2. And then the debts had come. Men in suits with papers that said she owed money for passage, for lodging, for goods purchased on credit she had never asked for. She had tried to explain, tried to show them that she had paid her own way, but they did not listen. The law in Blackwater Falls was whatever Montgomery Steele said it was, and Montgomery said she owed. When she could not pay, they arrested her for vagrancy and put her on the auction block. Lying in the narrow bed, Mabel wondered what Elias would have thought of all this. Would he have fought for her? Or would he have been part of the machinery that ground her down? She did not know. She had loved him, or thought she had. But love was a complicated thing when desperation was involved. And now he was gone, and she was alone. And the only person who had shown her a shred of decency was a Lakota warrior who had spent his last coins to buy her freedom or something close to it. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her dreams were dark and full of voices. The auctioneer's grating shout, the laughter of the crowd, the rattle of chains. Just before dawn, the fragile peace shattered. Mabel woke to the sound of heavy boots on the stairs and raised voices in the hallway. She sat up, her heart pounding, and heard the widow's voice shrill with fear. "I don't want trouble, take it outside." Then a fist hammered on her door, and a man's voice barked, "Open up by order of the sheriff." Mabel scrambled out of bed, her hands shaking as she looked around for a weapon, for an escape, for anything. The chair under the doorknob would not hold for long. She could hear them working at the lock, the scrape of metal on metal. Then another voice, low and calm. "Step back." "Honyahaka." The hammering stopped. Mabel pressed her ear to the door and heard the sheriff's voice, louder now, blustering. "You got no authority here, Injun. That woman belongs to Montgomery Steele. Got a judge's order right here. Now step aside or we'll arrest you too." "She walks with me," Honyahaka said again, the same words he had spoken in the stockyard. But this time there was steel beneath them. "Like hell she does." Mabel heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. She wrenched the chair free and threw the door open just as the hallway exploded into chaos. The sheriff and two deputies stood in the narrow space, and behind them, elegant and cold as a winter morning, was Montgomery Steele himself. Montgomery was a man who understood the power of appearance. He wore a tailored coat of fine black wool, a silk vest with a gold watch chain, and boots polished to a mirror shine. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair slicked back with pomade, and his pale eyes held the kind of contempt that came from a lifetime of owning things and people. He looked at Mabel the way a man might look at a horse that had wandered out of its stall. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth and faintly amused. "What a lot of trouble you've caused. I paid good money for your passage, and you have the audacity to run off with this savage. Quite ungrateful, really." "I didn't ask for your money," Mabel said, her voice trembling with rage. "I paid my own way. I don't owe you nothing." Montgomery smiled, a thin, cold smile. "The law says otherwise, and the law, Miss Carter, is on my side." He turned to Honyahaka. "As for you, I suggest you leave town before something unfortunate happens. We don't take kindly to Indians interfering in white business." Honyahaka did not move. His carbine was leveled at the nearest deputy, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The hallway was narrow, barely wide enough for two men to stand abreast, and the tension was so thick it felt like the air before a lightning strike. "She is not your property," Honyahaka said quietly. "She is whatever I say she is." Montgomery replied, his smile fading. "Now, Sheriff, do your job." The sheriff, a coward at heart, but paid well enough to pretend, otherwise nodded to his deputies. "Take her." One of the deputies, a thick man with a club, lunged for Mabel. Honyahaka shifted his aim, and the carbine roared, the sound deafening in the confined space. The shot went high, punching through a kerosene lamp hanging from a hook on the wall. Glass shattered, and burning oil spilled down the wallpaper flames, racing up toward the ceiling with terrifying speed. In the chaos, Honya Haka grabbed Mabel's arm and shoved her toward the back stairs. She stumbled, her legs still weak from days of captivity, but he steadied her and pulled her forward. Behind them, the flames spread with a hungry, crackling roar, smoke filling the corridor. The widow shrieked, and someone shouted for water. They hit the ground floor at a run. A deputy burst through the kitchen door, gun drawn, but Mabel, driven by pure instinct, snatched up a coal shovel from beside the stove and swung it with all her strength. The metal connected with the man's knees, and he went down howling. She and Honya Haka burst out into the alley, the heat at their backs, the smell of smoke thick in their lungs. A saddled mare stood at the hitching rail, reins loose. Honya Haka grabbed the horse and swung Mabel up first, then vaulted on behind her. They rode hard, the horse's hooves pounding the packed earth, as behind them Widow Smith and Dr. Franklin fought the fire with buckets of water and curses. The last thing Mabel saw as they galloped out of town was Montgomery Steele standing in the street, his face illuminated by the firelight, his expression calm and calculating, as if he were already planning his next move. The prairie stretched out before them like an endless sea, rolling hills of dry grass and stone broken only by the occasional stand of cottonwoods or the twisted shapes of juniper trees. The sun climbed higher, and the heat grew brutal, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Mabel clung to the saddle horn, her body aching from the rough gait of the horse. She had ridden before, but never for more than an hour or two, and never at this pace. Honya Haka rode beside her on a second horse, a paint gelding he had borrowed from a Lakota trader on the outskirts of town. He did not speak, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. The road north to the Lakota camp was not a road at all, just a faint trail worn into the grass by travelers and game. And it cut across open prairie where there was no cover, no place to hide. By midday, Mabel was swaying in the saddle, her vision swimming. The heat was merciless, and thirst had turned her mouth to sand. On a rocky slope where the ground was loose with shale, the horse slipped, and she almost tumbled. Honya Haka, riding close beside her, caught the back of her dress and hauled her upright, nearly losing his own seat in the process. "Hold on," he said, his voice steady. "We stop soon." They stopped at a bend in the Blackwater River, though calling it a river was generous. The dam upstream had strangled the flow, leaving only stagnant pools and exposed rocks sharp enough to cut a hand. The riverbed was a broken thing, muddy and lifeless. Mabel slid from the saddle and nearly collapsed, her legs buckling. She knelt by one of the pools, desperate to drink, but Honya Haka stopped her. "No," he said. "The water is bad here. Sick water." He uncorked his canteen and pressed it into her hands. "You need it more than I do," she protested weakly. "With this river dying, we both do," he said. "Drink anyway." She drank the water, cool and clean, tasting faintly of metal from the canteen. She drank until her stomach cramped, then wiped her mouth and handed the canteen back. Honya Haka drank sparingly, his eyes never leaving the trail behind them. "Thank you," Mabel said, her voice hoarse. Honya Haka capped the canteen and hooked it back on his saddle. "Do not thank me yet. They will come after us. Montgomery does not let things go." "Why?" Mabel asked. "I'm just one woman. Why does he care?" Honya Haka turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "Because you are not just one woman. You are a symbol. If he lets you go, others will think they can go too, and his power is built on fear and control. He cannot allow that." Mabel sat down on a rock, her whole body trembling with exhaustion. "I don't understand this place. I don't understand how one man can own so much. Back in Tennessee, we were poor, but at least we knew who our enemies were. Here, the law is the enemy. The judge is the enemy. Even the river. She gestured at the muddy trickle. Even the river is owned. Hanyahaka sat down beside her, his movements careful, as if he were approaching a wild animal. My grandmother used to say that the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. The white men do not understand this. They think land is something you can own, like a horse or a rifle. They think water is something you can take and hoard. But water is life, and life cannot be owned. Your grandmother sounds wise, Mabel said. She was, Honyahaka replied. She walked the long road, the one the white men forced our people to walk when they took our lands in the east. Many died on that road. My grandmother survived, but she never forgot. She taught me to see the world clearly, without the lies that powerful men tell. He paused, then added, "She would have liked you." "Why?" Mabel asked, surprised. "Because you have a strong spine," Honyahaka said simply. "And because you have not given up even when they tried to break you." Mabel looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something shift inside her. It was not attraction, not yet. There was no room for that in the midst of fear and exhaustion. But it was recognition. She saw in him the same thing she had carried her whole life, the weight of being seen as less than human. The exhaustion of fighting for dignity in a world that denied it at every turn. "What about you?" she asked quietly. "Why did you come to this town?" "You said you came to talk to Montgomery about what?" Honyahaka gestured at the dying river. "About this. 5 years ago, Montgomery built his dam. He promised water for everyone, steady and fair. But the water does not flow free. He charges tolls and the price keeps rising. My people live downstream. Our gardens are dying. Our children are hungry. I came to ask him to open the dam to let the river flow as it should. But he would not see me. His men told me to leave, or they would arrest me." "And you bought me instead," Mabel said. "Yes." Honyahaka looked at her, and there was something like regret in his eyes. "I do not know if it was wise, but it felt necessary." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the dry grass. Then Mabel said, "My husband, Elias, he wrote me letters. Said there was land out here, work a future. I spent every cent I had to come out on the wagon train. When I got here, he was all smiles. We got married, moved into a company house near the mine." She paused, her throat tightening. 2 months later, he was dead. Collapse, they said. And then the debts came, passage fees, lodging, interest on money I never borrowed. They arrested me for vagrancy when I couldn't pay. Honyahaka listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The hawk does not choose the wind that carries it, but it chooses whether to fight or fall." Mabel smiled despite herself. "Your grandmother again?" "Yes." Honyahaka stood and offered her his hand. "We should go. The sun is high and we have far to ride." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. His grip was strong and steady, and for the first time since Elias died, she felt like she was not alone. That night, they sheltered in an abandoned line shack, a sagging structure with half a roof and walls full of gaps where the wind whistled through. There was no fire. Honyahaka said the smoke would give them away, so they huddled in the darkness, wrapped in blankets, listening to the sounds of the prairie. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the grass, the creak of old wood settling. Mabel could not sleep. Her mind churned with fear and questions. She kept seeing Montgomery's face, that cold smile, the way he had looked at her, as if she were a piece of property he had misplaced. She wondered what he would do when he caught them, and she had no doubt that he would try. Men like Montgomery did not lose. Around midnight, she heard hoofbeats. She froze, her heart hammering, and crawled to a gap in the wall. Two riders passed close enough that she could see their faces in the moonlight. One of them carried a lantern that swung from his saddle horn. "Montgomery wants that contract back," one of the men said, his voice carrying in the still air. "He paid good money for her passage. She's his property, legal or not. And that Injun's gonna hang for burning down the boarding house." "Hell of a thing," the other man muttered. "World's gone to blazes when a savage can buy a colored woman and think he's done something noble." They moved on, and Mabel pressed her forehead against the rough wood, trying to steady her breathing. Honyahaka appeared beside her, silent as a ghost. "They are hunting us," he said quietly. "I know." Mabel turned to look at him. "Maybe I should go back. If I turn myself in, maybe he'll leave you alone." "No," Honyahaka said, his voice firm. "He is not hunting you because of a contract. He is hunting you because you defied him. And he is hunting me because I helped you. If you go back, he will take you, and then he will come for me anyway. We are safer together." "Safer?" Mabel laughed bitterly. "We're running for our lives across the prairie, with no food, no water, and men with guns on our trail. How is that safe?" "Safer than alone," Honyahaka said. "Trust me." Mabel looked at him at the seriousness in his eyes and realized that she did trust him. It was a strange, fragile thing, this trust built on nothing but a few hours of shared danger. But it was real. "All right," she said. "I trust you." The Lakota encampment sprawled along the banks of the river, where the water was barely a trickle between smooth stones. Teepees and canvas tents dotted the grass, their hides bleached pale by the sun. Small gardens of stunted corn struggled in the dry soil, and children carried empty buckets back and forth in a ritual that had become more habit than hope. Old women sat in the shade, their faces carved with the lines of too many hard winters, and watched the river as if they could will it back to life. When Honyahaka and Mabel rode into camp, people gathered to stare. The children whispered in Lakota, pointing at Mabel's dark skin and travel-stained dress. The elders watched Honyahaka with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern. A Lakota warrior returning with a black woman was not something that happened every day. And in a community where survival depended on unity and careful negotiation with the white authorities, anything unusual was cause for alarm. Honyahaka dismounted and helped Mabel down. Her legs nearly gave out, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. An older woman approached her face kind but wary and said something in Lakota. Honyahaka replied, his tone respectful, and the woman nodded and gestured for Mabel to follow her. Inside a tent, Mabel was given water and a bowl of thin stew made from cornmeal and dried meat. It was the first hot food she had eaten in days, and she devoured it, despite the exhaustion that weighed on her like a stone. The woman, whose name she learned was Winona, did not speak English, but she tended to Mabel's blistered feet and raw wrists with a gentleness that needed no translation. That evening, a council was held. Mabel sat at the edge of the gathering, feeling out of place and desperately self-conscious. She did not speak Lakota, and though some of the people present spoke a little English, most of the conversation flowed around her like a river she could not ford. But she understood the tone, worry, anger, fear. She understood that her presence here was a complication, a risk. Finally, an elder named 10 Bears, a man with a face like weathered stone and eyes that had seen too many winters, turned to her and spoke in halting English. "You bring trouble," he said bluntly. "White man who owns the dam, he will come here looking for you. He will use you as excuse to hurt us." Mabel swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It does not matter what you meant." 10 Bears said not unkindly, "What matters is what will happen. Montgomery Steele is a dangerous man. He owns the water, the law, the guns. If we anger him, he will cut off what little water we have left. Our people will die. Honyahaka spoke then, his voice calm but firm. He spoke in Lakota, and though Mabel could not understand the words, she understood the cadence, the rhythm of a man, trying to hold people together when everything was falling apart. When he finished, 10 bears looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We wait," the elder said in English, looking at Mabel. "But if the white man comes, you may have to leave. We cannot protect you if it means death for our children." Mabel nodded her throat tight. "I understand." While Mabel and Honyahaka hid in the Lakota camp, word of the fire at the boarding house and the confrontation in the hallway spread through Blackwater Falls like wildfire. Franklin Hayes, who had helped fight the blaze and treated burns on 3 townspeople, listened to the rumors and felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He knew Montgomery Steele well enough to know that the Baron would not let this go. Montgomery was a man who ruled through control and fear, and Honyahaka's defiance and Mabel's escape threatened that control. Franklin had been in Blackwater Falls for 15 years, long enough to see the town change from a rough mining camp into something more sinister, a company town, where one man held all the power and used it without mercy. He had seen people disappear, seen debts fabricated out of thin air, seen women brought west on promises of marriage, only to find themselves trapped in a kind of bondage that had no name, but was no less real for that. He had wanted to speak out to do something, but he was a coward at heart, and cowards survived by keeping their heads down. But now something had shifted. Maybe it was the sight of Mabel on that auction block, her dignity unbroken despite everything. Maybe it was the quiet courage of the Lakota warrior who had spent his last coins to buy her freedom. Or maybe it was just that Franklin had seen enough and his conscience, long dormant, had finally woken up. That night, he slipped into Montgomery's office under the pretense of checking for smoke damage from the fire. The building was empty, the clerks and foremen gone home, and Franklin worked quickly, his hands sweating as he lit a shielded candle and began to copy pages from the ledgers on Montgomery's desk. The ledgers were a record of everything: labor contracts, passage fees, debts owed, and collected bribes paid to the sheriff, and the judge payments to recruiters who lured workers and brides west with false promises. Franklin copied as much as he could, his hand cramping, his eyes burning from the strain. And then he found an entry that made his blood run cold. Elias Carter Recruiter Commission paid monthly until death. Mine incident resolved. No further payments necessary. Beside it, in Montgomery's own handwriting, was a note: EC becoming liability. Mine supports weakened, Section 4. Incident scheduled. Franklin stared at the words, his mind racing. Elias Carter was Mabel's late husband. The mine collapse that had killed him and a dozen other men had not been an accident. It had been murder planned and executed by Montgomery to silence a man who had become a liability. Franklin copied the page with shaking hands and then closed the ledger and slipped out of the office the way he had come, his heart pounding. He did not know yet what he would do with the information, but he knew it was dangerous enough to get him killed. And he knew that Mabel deserved to know the truth. 3 days passed in the Lakota camp, 3 days of waiting and watching the horizon for signs of Montgomery's men. Mabel helped where she could, hauling water, grinding corn, mending torn clothing. She learned a few words of Lakota from the women who treated her with a cautious kindness. She learned to move quietly, to listen to the sounds of the prairie, to read the sky for signs of weather. And she learned about Honyahaka. She learned that he had lost his wife and young son to fever 3 winters ago, a sickness brought by white traders that had swept through the camp and taken a dozen lives. She learned that he had been a warrior, once had fought in the wars that the white men called uprisings, and the Lakota called defense. She learned that he carried the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders, and that the trip to Blackwater Falls had been a desperate gamble, a last attempt to negotiate before desperation drove them to violence. They talked in the evenings, sitting by the river, where the trickle of water was barely enough to wet the stones. Mabel told him about her mother, who had been born into slavery and lived to see freedom, who had taught Mabel to read in secret, and told her that knowledge was the one thing they could not chain. She told him about the long journey west, about the hope that had carried her across the plains, and the crushing weight of disappointment when she arrived. She told him about Elias, about the mine collapse, about the debts that had appeared like ghosts. And Honyahaka told her about the old ways, the ways his grandmother had taught him. He told her about the belief that the earth did not belong to people, but people belonged to the earth. He told her about the sacred hoop, the circle of life that connected all things, and how the white men had broken that circle with their dams and their fences and their insatiable hunger for ownership. "We are not so different, you and I," Honyahaka said one evening, his voice quiet. "We have both been told that we are less than human, that we do not deserve the same dignity, the same freedom. But we know the truth. We are human. We are strong, and we will not be broken." Mabel looked at him, and for the first time since Elias died, she felt something stir inside her that was more than survival, more than defiance. It was connection. It was the fragile beginning of something she could not yet name, but that felt against all odds like hope. The fragile peace shattered on the fourth day. Dr. Franklin Hayes rode into the Lakota camp at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his face pale and drawn. He had ridden through the night, and he brought news that turned Mabel's blood to ice. Montgomery had put out a bounty on Honyahaka, and Mabel $50 for Honyahaka, $30 for Mabel dead or alive. He had also promised free grazing rights on his land to anyone who brought them in. Half the men in Blackwater Falls were forming a posse, and they would be here by nightfall. "We have to move," Franklin said, his voice tight with urgency. "But there's more. I found something in Montgomery's ledgers." He pulled out the copied pages and handed them to Mabel. "Your husband didn't die in an accident. Montgomery had the mine supports weakened. He killed Elias and 11 other men to cover up his crimes." Mabel stared at the paper, the words swimming before her eyes. EC, becoming liability. Mine supports weakened, Section 4. Incident scheduled. She felt the ground tilt beneath her, felt the world narrow to a pinpoint. Elias had not just died, he had been murdered, and Montgomery had buried him under tons of rock to keep his secrets safe. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he kill his own recruiter?" "Because Elias must have threatened to talk," Franklin said. "Maybe he had a crisis of conscience. Maybe he realized what he was doing, luring women west only to trap them in debt, and he couldn't live with it anymore. Whatever the reason, Montgomery saw him as a liability, and Montgomery doesn't tolerate liabilities." Mabel's hands shook as she folded the paper and tucked it into her dress. The pain was overwhelming, a raw wound that would not close. Elias had been guilty, yes. He had sold her and other women into bondage knowingly or not. But he had also been a victim, silenced before he could make things right. And Montgomery had taken that from him, taken everything. Honyahaka put a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. "We will make him answer for this," he said quietly. "I swear it." Mabel looked up at him, her eyes burning with tears and rage. "How he owns everything. The law, the guns, the water. How do we fight that?" "With the truth," Franklin said. "With proof. If we can get this ledger to a territorial marshal, someone outside Montgomery's control, we can bring him down. But we have to move fast, and we have to be smart." A plan began to form, desperate and dangerous. Franklin would ride to the nearest telegraph office and send word to the territorial marshal. Hanyahaca Mabel and a few trusted allies would ride back to Blackwater Falls and steal the original ledger, the one that contained all of Montgomery's crimes in black and white. It was insane suicidal even, but it was the only chance they had. William Eriksson, a Swedish immigrant farmer who had been slowly strangled by Montgomery's water tolls and debt schemes, joined them. William was a quiet man with calloused hands and a face lined by worry. His wife Inga was sick with a cough that would not go away, and his children were thin and hollow-eyed. Montgomery's foreman had offered William a job at the dam Steady Pay Guaranteed Water, but Inga had looked at him with fierce eyes and said in Swedish, "Do not become the thing you ran from in the old country." So William had come to the Lakota camp instead, hat in hand, offering what little he knew about the dam's construction and Montgomery's operation. Together, Hanyahaca Mabel Franklin and William, they rode back to Blackwater Falls on market day, when the streets would be crowded enough to provide cover. They hid in the back of William's wagon under canvas and burlap, the heat suffocating, the smell of sweat and fear thick in the air. When they reached Montgomery's office, Franklin used the key he had borrowed from the drunk clerk and unlocked the side door. The building was quiet, the clerks and foremen occupied with the market day crowds. Inside, the shelves sagged with leather-bound ledgers, each one a record of Montgomery's empire. Mabel's hands trembled as she searched, flipping through pages with mounting desperation. Finally, she found the volume labeled Labor Contracts and Transport Accounts. She opened it and saw her own name, Mabel Carter Passage Advanced, to be worked off under Silver Spur Co. And beside it, in the margin, Recruiter Elias Carter Commission, paid monthly. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Her husband had sold her. He had lured her west, married her, and delivered her into Montgomery's hands. And then Montgomery had killed him to keep him quiet. Franklin, keeping watch at the door, whispered urgently, "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the door burst open and a guard appeared, his eyes widening as he saw the open safe and the stolen ledger. He reached for his gun, and the office exploded into violence. Shots rang out deafening in the small space. William grabbed the ledger and shoved it under his coat. Hanyahaca fired back the carbine's roar, shaking the walls, driving the guard behind a desk, long enough for them to scramble toward the back window. They crashed through glass shattering and hit the alley running. Behind them, the alarm was raised. Men shouting, boots pounding. They threw themselves into the wagon, and William whipped the horses into a gallop. Bullets whined past, punching holes in the canvas. One grazed William's thigh, blood soaking his trousers, and he bit back a scream but kept driving. They made it out of town by the narrowest of margins, and the posse hard on their heels. Only when they had crossed several miles of open prairie did the pursuit finally fall back, the posse's horses too winded to continue. But the victory was hollow. William was bleeding the wound deep, and infection was a death sentence out here. Back at the Lakota camp, Dr. Franklin worked by firelight, cutting open William's thigh and draining the bullet track. William writhed and screamed, his voice raw, while Mabel held his arms and Hanyahaca pinned his shoulders. There was no anesthetic, no clean bandages, just whiskey and determination. Inga, who had arrived with their children, sat beside her husband and sang softly in Swedish, her voice a thread of comfort in the midst of agony. "Hold him still." Franklin ordered, his hands slick with blood. He poured whiskey into the wound, and William's back arched, his scream so loud that birds flew from the cottonwoods. Afterward, they wrapped him in blankets and waited. The fever came that night, burning through William's body, and for 2 days they were not sure he would survive. Inga never left his side, bathing his forehead with cool water, whispering prayers in a language Mabel did not understand, but felt in her bones. On the 3rd day, the fever broke and William opened his eyes. He was weak, pale as milk, but alive. "The ledger?" he rasped. "Safe," Franklin said. "You did it, William. You got it out." William closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath. "Good." Montgomery Steele's response was swift and brutal. At dawn the next morning, his hired riders raided the Lakota camp, firing over tents, scattering cook fires, and dragging 2 horses and a teenage boy away for questioning. They left a message carved into a lodgepole with a knife: "Return my property, or the river dies." The camp was in chaos. Some of the elders demanded that Mabel be turned over to Montgomery, that the risk was too great, that their children's lives were more important than one woman's freedom. Others argued that to surrender, Mabel would be to surrender their dignity, to prove that the white men could take whatever they wanted. Mabel listened to the shouting, her heart breaking. That night she told Honiahaka, "If I go back, maybe he'll leave your people alone. It's my fault they're suffering." "No," Honiahaka said, his voice firm. "He is not hunting you because of a contract. He is hunting you because you are a symbol. If he breaks you, he breaks all of us. We stand together or we fall alone. But your people, my people, have survived worse than Montgomery Steele," Honiahaka said. "And we will survive this. But only if we fight. Only if we show him that we cannot be bought or broken." Mabel looked at him, at the fierce conviction in his eyes, and felt something inside her shift. She had spent so long just trying to survive, to endure, that she had forgotten what it felt like to fight. But Honiahaka was reminding her, and she realized that she was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all the people Montgomery had crushed, all the women he had enslaved, all the families he had destroyed. "All right," she said. "We fight." The plan was desperate, perhaps even suicidal, but it was all they had. Montgomery had called a town meeting in the stockyard, ostensibly to discuss water tolls and law enforcement. But everyone knew it was a trap. He was baiting Honiahaka and Mabel, daring them to show their faces so he could finish this publicly in front of witnesses with the full weight of the law, his law, behind him. Honiahaka, Mabel, Franklin, and a limping William decided to walk into the trap. But they would not go empty-handed. They carried the ledger, the proof of Montgomery's crimes, and they carried the hope that they could reach the territorial marshal before Montgomery's men killed them. They arrived at the stockyard just as Montgomery stepped onto the auction platform, the same platform where Mabel had been sold weeks before. The crowd was thick men with rifles slung across their backs, their faces hard and expectant. Montgomery was resplendent in his tailored coat and polished boots, every inch the gentleman rancher. He looked out over the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had never lost, who had never even considered the possibility of losing. "We have thieves among us," he announced, his voice carrying across the yard with the precision of a trained orator. "Thieves who burned down Widow Smith's boarding house, who robbed my office, who assaulted lawmen in the course of their duties. They hide among savages and plot against the very fabric of civilization." As he spoke, Honiahaka and the others stepped into view at the edge of the crowd. A ripple of whispers spread, and men turned to stare. Montgomery pointed, his face cold with triumph. "There, seize them." The crowd surged forward, a mob howling for blood. Guns were drawn, ropes held high. The sheriff, a coward but well paid, shouted that frontier justice was the only answer, that the jail was too good for such scum. Outnumbered and surrounded, the 4 of them retreated into the livery barn, slamming the heavy doors and throwing a wagon tongue across to brace them. Bullets immediately began punching through the wooden planks, splinters flying hay dust, jumping into the air with each impact. The noise was deafening, the smell of gunpowder thick and choking. Outside, Montgomery's voice rang out cold and merciless. "Burn them out. I want that ledger, and I want them dead." Someone piled straw against the barn wall and set it alight. Smoke began to seep through the cracks, thickening rapidly, and the heat rose. William, feverish and in pain, propped himself at a gap in the planks and fired slow, careful shots to keep the mob from rushing the doors. Franklin reloaded for him, his hands shaking, sweat pouring down his face. Up in the loft, Mabel heard the bellow of cattle. She crawled to a crack in the boards and looked out. The barn backed onto a pen where at least 100 steers were crammed together, restless and agitated by the noise and the smoke. She remembered her time at the stockyard back east, the way cattle moved, the way they panicked. Those pens, she said, her voice tight with sudden realization. If we let them loose toward the noise. Can you do it? Franklin asked, his eyes wide. I can try. The flames were climbing the walls now, tongues of fire licking up toward the roof. The heat was unbearable, and smoke stung her eyes. Honeyahaka boosted her up the ladder to the loft, his hands steady and strong. The whole structure shuddered and groaned. Be careful, he said, his voice low and urgent. She crawled along a narrow beam toward the gate rope that held the cattle pen shut. The beam was old, splintered, every movement making it creak ominously. Below, the mob roared, guns firing, and the cattle bellowed in terror. Honeyahaka climbed halfway up and braced the beam with his shoulder, literally supporting her weight as she sawed at the rope with a knife. She could feel the heat of the fire, the choking smoke, the awful certainty that they were all going to die here. The knife slipped, biting into her palm. Blood ran hot and slick, but she kept cutting her teeth, gritted her breath, coming in ragged gasps. And then the rope snapped. The gate slammed open with a sound like thunder. The cattle, maddened by smoke and fear, exploded from the pen in a living avalanche. They burst through the thin wall separating the pen from the street and poured into the crowd like a force of nature, unstoppable, devastating, terrifying. Men scattered screaming. Some were trampled, their bodies disappearing beneath the tide of hooves and horns. Others were thrown aside, rifles and ropes flying through the air. The ground shook, the noise a roar that drowned out everything else. Honeyahaka dropped from the loft, grabbed Franklin and William, and hauled them toward a side door. He kicked it open just as the roof began to collapse, beams crashing down in a shower of sparks and burning wood. They lunged for a wagon hitched nearby, Mabel landing hard in the bed, her hand bleeding, her lungs burning. Montgomery, standing on a fence post to avoid the stampede, raised his pistol and fired. The shot grazed Mabel's arm, tearing through cloth and skin, and she cried out. Honeyahaka leapt from the moving wagon and tackled Montgomery, and they went down in the churned mud, rolling as hooves thundered past, missing them by inches. Montgomery was strong, desperate, a man who had never lost and could not comprehend losing now. He twisted, swinging a broken board at Honeyahaka's head. Honeyahaka ducked, but the move left Montgomery exposed. And then from across the chaos, a shot rang out. Not from the mob, but from the sheriff. The sheriff, who had been watching from a safe distance, had made a choice. Montgomery had humiliated him too many times, belittled him in front of the town, treated him like a dog on a leash. And now, with the posse in disarray and the barn burning, the sheriff saw his chance. He fired not at Honeyahaka, but at Montgomery. The bullet caught Montgomery in the shoulder, spinning him around. He stumbled, and in that moment of imbalance, a steer slammed into him with the force of a landslide. Montgomery went down hard, and the stampede rolled over him. When the dust settled, Montgomery's steel lay broken in the street. He had built his eyes open and empty, his empire crumbling around him. The sheriff dropped his rifle and raised his hands, his face pale. I had nothing to do with his crimes, he said quickly, desperately. I just enforced the law. I didn't know about the murders or the fake contracts. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. But it was also a surrender. As the last of the stampede clattered away down the road, a new sound rose, the thunder of hooves from the east. A column of riders appeared dust-streaked and grim badges gleaming in the firelight. The territorial marshal had arrived, brought by Franklin's urgent telegraph, and the testimony of a dozen people who had finally found the courage to speak. Dr. Franklin staggered forward, his clothes torn and blackened with soot, and laid the stolen ledger on a toppled crate. "This is Montgomery Steele's ledger," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "It documents every crime, the forged contracts, the bribes, the murders. He killed Elias Carter and 11 other miners to cover his tracks. He enslaved women brought west on false promises. He stole land, water, and lives." The marshal, a lean man with a graying beard and eyes that had seen every kind of frontier cruelty, took the ledger and flipped through it slowly. His expression darkened with each page. Widow Smith stepped forward, a bandage around her forehead. "He burned my house because that man," she pointed at Honyahaka, "tried to help a woman being sold like chattel." Small farmers testified about the crushing water tolls. William's wife Inga, still pale and coughing, held up her husband's blood-stained trousers. "They shot him for telling the truth." The marshal listened to it all, and when the testimonies were done, he turned to the crowd. "Montgomery Steele's properties are hereby seized pending federal inquiry. The dam will be opened under government control, and any man who participated in this," he gestured at the chaos, "will answer for it." The crowd fell silent, uncertain, the bloodlust draining away into confusion and fear. By late summer, after weeks of testimony in the territorial court, Mabel and Honyahaka stood again on the banks of the Blackwater River and watched as government workers pried the timbers free from Montgomery's dam. The wood groaned and splintered, and then the water came, a wall of it, foaming white and cold, roaring through the breach and spilling back into the dry channel. The sound was like thunder, and the spray caught the light in rainbows. Downstream at the Lakota camp, children shrieked with joy as the river swelled, overflowing its banks and soaking the parched earth. Gardens that had withered began to turn green again. Mabel felt tears streaming down her face, but she was not sure if they were tears of grief or relief or something in between. She thought of Elias, of the man she had loved, and the man he had actually been. She thought of the mine collapse, the lies, the chains. And she thought of the fragile, unexpected hope that had grown between her and Honyahaka, born from shared danger and mutual respect. Honyahaka stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "The river runs free," he said quietly. "For all of us." "Yes," Mabel said. "But it costs so much." "Freedom always does." 3 weeks later, Blackwater Falls was a different place. The stockyard where Mabel had been sold now hosted an open market where Lakota women traded beadwork for flour, black families sold vegetables from reclaimed plots, and white farmers bartered tools and seed. The air still smelled of dust and horses, but the edge of cruelty had dulled. People spoke to each other cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, building something new from the wreckage of the old. On the edge of town, near a fence overlooking the river and hills, Honyahaka stood in full ceremonial dress. He wore a war bonnet that flowed down his back, a breastplate of bone and beads gleaming in the low sun. Beside him, Mabel wore a simple but well-fitted brown dress, no longer threadbare. Her sleeves were rolled, her hands calloused from digging irrigation ditches. Dr. Franklin arrived, carrying a worn envelope. "This came through the marshal's office," he said, handing it to Mabel. "Found among the mine records." Inside was a letter in Elias's handwriting dated 2 days before the collapse. He admitted recruiting women for Montgomery, then realizing he had delivered them into bondage. He described going to a federal agent with a confession, planning to testify. The letter ended. "If you are reading this, I am dead, and Montgomery has won. But I tried, Mabel. I swear I tried to make it right." Mabel folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her bodice. The pain would never fully leave, but this knowing that Elias had tried to atone lifted some of the weight. "He was weak," she said quietly. "But he tried. That's more than most." Hanyahaka set a boundary stone at the edge of Lakota land where it met the new cooperative plots. The stone was heavy, marked with symbols that told a story of water and survival. Mabel carried her own stone and dropped it beside his. Their fingers brushed on the rough surface, and neither pulled away. "The river runs for many people now," he said. "And none of them own me?" she replied. After a breath, she added, "But I'd stay, if you asked." He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes steady. "I ask, not as employer, not as savior, as a man who would walk beside you if you will have me." She smiled, the first real smile she had worn since arriving in this place. "Then I stay, and I walk beside you." They stood together at the fence line, Lakota warrior in full regalia and Black Widow turned free woman. And the town and prairie stretching behind them, the Blackwater running strong and clear. Children played in the water downstream. Smoke rose from cook fires, where families of all colors shared meals and stories. William and Inga reclaimed their farm, planting winter wheat with seed donated by the Lakota community. Franklin became the town doctor, his salary paid by the territorial government. Widow Smith rebuilt her boarding house with help from a dozen volunteers. The miracle was not that Honyahaka had bought Mabel for $5, but that together they had broken the chains off every life Montgomery had tried to own. They had turned a river of injustice back into a river of life, and in doing so had found each other not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, steady work of survival and the unbreakable bond forged in shared struggle. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky gold and crimson, and the river sang its old song loud and clear, a sound that promised tomorrow. Honyahaka's hand found Mabel's, their fingers intertwining, and they stood together as the first stars appeared. Two people who had been marked for chains and death, now standing free under a sky that belonged to no one and everyone. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs. And that was miracle enough.